it matters to us as United Methodists that we care about these things.
But there's moments where Jesus challenges us, and if we're going to be formed, we've got to step out beyond that space.
I'm never going to declare myself one way or the other because I'm going to always stick to specific issues and vote like based on how my faith calls me to vote on these things.
This is Pod Strangely Warmed, a place where we tell the good Methodist story, where we have conversations that invite followers of Jesus to seek after that loving, just, and free world that God imagines for us all, and have a little fun along the way. Hi, and welcome back to Pod Strangely Warmed. We're here in the studio in Plano for our first in-person episode of the new year, and we are excited and having a good time already. and you may be a little surprised given the topic we're going to be talking about today. But today's topic is the intersection of our faith and public life and how our faith informs our political engagement and enterprise. And today, joining me on the podcast, I'm excited to welcome Reverend Anne Sipe and Reverend Dieke. Thank you so much for being here on the podcast. I hope you survived conversations around Christmas dinner that related to this topic and that you're fresh and ready to go for this beginning of the new year.
Oh yeah, my family just expects that politics is a part of the conversation at dinner, so they've come to understand.
They've come to understand that if Phil is arriving, this is coming with it.
Yes,
very good.
Absolutely.
Well, and there's something actually Methodist about this engagement with our whole life. Our faith doesn't just fit in a box; it expands beyond the box of what we do in church on Sunday mornings or Saturday nights or whenever we go to church, but into the everyday, ordinary of our existence, including our public life. Sure. And that's part of what I hope you guys can help us explore a little bit today through the work that you do at church, but also primarily through the work you do with Texas Impact. Mm-hmm. Both of y'all are on the board with Texas Impact. But before we get there, let's take just a minute to get to know y'all. We've asked you to bring something that represents yourself to live on the shelf in a segment that we love to call Self on a Shelf, in part because Dustin hates it. Yeah. Although coming out of Christmas and Advent, it actually is somewhat culturally relevant, right? We've gotten rid of the elf on a shelf, and now we have the self on a shelf. Amen. 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 Ashley, and what did you bring for us? You didn't bring your elf for yourself on a shelf.
No,
what did you bring for yourself on a shelf
I brought my
today?
plant on a stand. Oh, no, it's a plant. I brought my plant, and that's not surprising to anybody watching or listening to this podcast. I'm a plant lady, which is a later in life discovery. I used to never plant anything, but that's been a huge thing that's brought me a lot of peace and comfort in the latter years of my ministry and work. And it has a lot to do with how I view the world, how I view myself, how I view my faith. And so planting and watching things grow and depending on the weekly nurturing care that it takes to slow down and grow things has really made me, I feel like, a better person, a more present pastor, and definitely a more hopeful parent as I watch, nurture, prune, and do all the hard work of parenting as well alongside of it. So I brought one of my plants from home.
Very good.
Thanks.
I love that image, and especially the work of ministry and the life of ministry, like our own faith formation. It's such a powerful metaphor of, we can plant, we can nurture, we can care, but we can't make it grow. Right.
And no plant lasts forever.
Right.
Which in my early ministry, I thought I could plant one plant, and it was the plant, and it was the only plant that my whole ministry, my whole life would be about. And when it died, what was I ever going to do again? And if you've ever
thought you planted the tree of life?
I did. Yeah. Well, yes, Phil.
Yes, I did.
Yes, I did. But yeah, I mean, that's just not the way that gardening works. It's not the way life works. And plants are meant to bloom for seasons, and then they go dormant, and there's different seasons, and there's different plants. And so anyways, there's just so much imagery there that has really helped me develop in my pastoral and in my ministry roles. So yeah.
Amen.
I'm
a
gardener.
There you go.
A really good metaphor.
Thank you.
You're good at that.
Well,
my fern died. I didn't bring my fern, but I have.
It's okay.
I now have two other plants that I have in my office now at home too. So I brought a report that we published at my job. I work at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary, and so I have two roles. One is overseeing a rural church initiative, and the other one is a young adult initiative as well. So this report, Next is Now, is one of the reports we did this past year, and it's a report. so it's not real exciting. But in a lot of ways, it represents what I really feel called to in ministry in general, is working with younger generations and recognizing that it's not just about the church of the future, but it really is about the church here and now.
Yeah.
And so I get a great passion out of the work I do with young people, young adults specifically. And so this is really a bridge between college ministry and young adult ministry that we're working on. And so had I not gone the family route, I would have loved to continue working in college ministry just because I think it's such a fun, and it was so formative for me in my upbringing too. So that report means a lot to me in my ongoing work, both as a clergy person, but my role at seminary as well. And then, we focus on college to young adult, but really to me, Nexus Now also represents kids, and I have children, you have children, so that means a lot too. And I get a lot of hope and inspiration from working with young people. So that's why I brought my Nexus Now report.
Very good.
It was in my bag too, so that was just helpful.
Hey, it's all right. That's all right. It's already here.
It's here, it's there.
It works.
No, it really is.
We carry with us things that represent us in our own way. And,
that's exactly right. It stays in my bag for that very reason. Yeah.
That's it. Anytime you're on a podcast and they ask you
really
to tell us who you are.
Well, not just the podcast, but like I share it with a lot of people though, because in a lot of ways it's work that I'm really proud of that we're doing at the seminary, and I really it is near and dear to me. So did I forget something? Yes. Did this make sense for what the self
Did you
on the
follow
shelf?
the email and the questions asked?
Look,
no.
Okay.
Do I get an A for bringing a plant?
You do.
Yes.
For those of you who did not know, Ashley Ann is an 8 on the Enneagram, and Phil is a 9.
That's right.
And
and
we're the best friends that anybody could ever have.
We go back a ways.
So
Yeah.
this is just love.
Right. That's right. Love in the form of aggression.
That's right.
And yeah.
Mine is just suppressed. It's fine.
Right. It's all good. Phil, if you were going to give us a summary of one of the key findings that you had in the midst of the Nexus Now, I mean, the title speaks for itself in a lot of ways, but so many of the folks listening to this podcast are churches who are deeply invested or want to be more competently invested
That's good,
in the lives of young adults and the young people in their midst. What was one of the kind of findings that you brought forth from that?
Yeah, so just kind of a quick background on it. We took young adults who had been really heavily involved in campus ministries and then interviewed to see where they were now. And about half of them were invested in some sort of community of faith, and half of them were not. Okay. And the ones who were not hadn't given up on faith. They had they still very much cared about their faith formation. It just often happened through podcasts or through YouTubes or whatever they would find spaces to do it, just not having community around it. And so what we found, some of the key takeaways was belonging is really important for young adults coming out of college. And it's really hard to find belonging often in churches. And so some of them are creating their own belonging spaces or spaces of belonging, I guess would be the right way to say that. And even creating their own ministry expressions outside of churches if they can't find it within the churches they've looked to. The other piece is that young adults just are always in transition. It's a constant state of transition from the time you graduate college, if you go that route, until 35 or whatever, your first job, second job, you get fired, you have, you move 14 times, you start relationships, you end relationships, you may have kids. There's just so many pieces of transition that are life-changing within that period of time. And so really helping navigate transitions has been a big piece that we found from that. And then the final piece, I think, was just the idea of mentorship. And they had a lot of opinions about mentorship. that some worked really well and some don't work well. And they had a lot of thoughts about that. And that we want it to happen organically. And sometimes we want to be mentored by older people, but we don't put ourselves in places to be in intergenerational connections. So it's hard to have it organic mentorship whenever you're not in those. So anyway, it was really fascinating study.
Very cool. Yeah. Very cool. Thank you. We may have you back on to unpack. One of the things we do periodically is have our college ministers on, right? Because I think it gives a window into the life at church that I think many of us who are in kind of established, long-standing churches that tend to be grayer need that voice in our midst, and so that our heart and our impact can align.
I love that.
In a meaningful way.
Shout out college ministers.
Absolutely.
All for them.
They're amazing crew of folks.
That's right.
And seem to have the most fun.
They have a lot of fun. They have a lot of fun.
Marcus is on the pod on a fairly regular basis. And every
Marcus.
time Marcus is on the pod, my life is better. And so life
Yep.
is good. As we kind of pivot a bit today, we've seen a little bit how your faith formation and your work shape every day. And at first blush, statewide politics may not feel like they fit in the era of planting or in the era of kind of helping young adults find their way in faith and community and belonging. as we just get started, we want to acknowledge kind of where you're at, but also recognize that you're both board members of Texas Impact. And Texas Impact at its core is what?
It's an interfaith advocacy organization that helps mainline people of faith throughout the state of Texas to embrace the justice work at the Texas state legislature. And so there's a lot of work to educate people about what happens at the legislature. And it's a two-way street where people on the ground and faith communities are reporting back of what they're finding in their communities to the organization, and the organization is reporting back what's happening at the legislature and helping with programming to equip them to go forth and do works of justice within their communities.
Very good. And this work of justice is work that Jesus pioneered. It's work that is a part of our work as the annual conference, right? We're followers of Jesus seeking after the loving, just, and free world that God imagines for all people.
Yep.
And some of that work is housed in our local churches, and some of that work is housed in the spaces where we inhabit as Christians or mainline people of faith across interfaith spaces outside of the four walls of our church. Ashley Ann, when did you first get connected to Texas Impact, and what kind of drew you into this work?
Phil made me do it.
Very persuasive.
No, we were a part of the TMF CLI cohort, which that's a lot of acronyms, but we're Methodists, right?
We
so
are.
that
We're
fits
fond of
in this
them.
space. So Texas Methodist Foundation has a courageous leadership imperative cohort. Say that 3 times fast.
Well, they have 2 cohorts,
did.
right?
Right,
Which is
right.
the
So,
thing to
so
make it
you're a
even
part of
more
this as
confusing.
well, Daniel.
I'm a center mass cohort guy. Y'all are on the edge.
In the
Edge folk,
same 3 years that we were in the Edge cohort, Daniel was in the Center cohort. And so part of what we did in the Edge cohort, I don't know if it was similar in the Center cohort, but it was talk about life outside of the 4 walls of the church. Yeah. And we definitely, during those 3 years, had experiences in different cities around the United States, and just in the midst of conversations with our Edge friends, is how does what we preach, how does what we study, what we learn, what does it really matter to our communities, to our families, to our friendships, to our everyday life? And so I think through those 3 years, my interest maybe and passion and heart for political justice, not just sort of the faith realm of what's going on in our churches. And of course, during those same 3 years was the same 3 years of leading towards General Conference and things like that. But it was really, how does everyday life for all of my neighbors inside and outside of the church, how does that really apply to who I am and what I do as a pastor? And what really came out of that was taking another step into being involved and joining the board of Texas Impact as one of the people who represents that side of our conference and that side of who we are as clergy members in the Horizon Texas Conference. And so I think it's been a great journey, and it's been one that has made me now look at everything that we do in the lens of how is this making a difference for the lives of my Texas neighbors, right? I no longer just think of it as like the neighbors who are just around this church, but my Texas neighbors, right? How are these decisions impacting us in a bigger way?
Very good. Phil, so you voluntold Ashley Ann into this. How did you get connected to begin with?
Well, it's kind of funny too. So when I started at White Rock,
She voluntold you?
Yeah, right. When I started at White Rock UMC back in 2020, Mitchell Boone was the pastor, and he had just gone on to be on Boom, Board of Ordaining Ministry. And so he said, I can't do this and be on the board of Texas Impact, so I need you to take my spot on Texas Impact. And so obviously it's 2020, everything's on Zoom at that point. I show up to the first Zoom meeting, and the executive director's like, wait, who are you?
Who are you?
I was like, oh, hi, I'm Phil Dieke. I'm coming from the North Texas Conference for Mitchell Boone. And she's like, where's Mitchell? And I was like, oh, he didn't tell you? Okay, shout out Mitchell. But then I fell in love with the work that they were doing, and so have been on the board since. So this is a technical thing. We are now it's the Legislative Council, because this is important though.
Yes.
We are having to rewrite our bylaws because of what's happening in the state of Texas with nonprofits and the way that some government officials are going after nonprofits. And so we had to really shore up our bylaws to say we can't have a 45-person board. So now our executive committee is now officially the board, whereas the 45 people that represent mainline people of faith from across the state of Texas are our Legislative Council. And the reason we had to do that was because lawsuits are happening currently with nonprofits, and they're going after nonprofits who are I would say helping the most marginalized communities within our state.
Or
So
challenging the status quo of
that's right.
who's in power right now in Austin.
So all to say, yeah, I've been on since 2020, and I'm honored now to serve on that. What was executive committee now is officially the board, and so there's a 501c3 and a 501c4 that Texas Impact has, and so part of it's just nonprofit work, and part of it's political nonprofit work. So.
Very good, very good. As our good Methodists, because the audience for this podcast is good Methodist nerds, right?
Love that.
And as good Methodist nerds, they're used to being in churches largely that are like big table churches, right? Where you've got people from across the political spectrum. And often in those kind of spaces, our historic default is we ain't going to talk about it, right? It is like money, we're not going to talk about it. And yet, talking about it and being active in this space outside of our church is kind of a part of who we are. It's connected to who we've been as United Methodists for as long as we've been United Methodists. We have these things called social principles, right? And my basic understanding is that they're intended to help us connect the faith and the foundations of who we are as United Methodist Christians to the everyday realities of our lives, right? And they're not church law, but they're a lens through which we can see the most pressing issues of our day and of our time. Does that fit with y'all's experience of what they are and what they represent?
Yeah, I think it definitely gives us a starting point of conversation. I mean, I would backtrack though and comment, of course, challenging what you just said in the fact that I do think that we've taken a back seat to having these conversations within our pews and look at where it's gotten us. I think that's a challenging mirror that we need to hold up and say, is this really the right path that we want to stay on as clergy, as people, as congregants? Or do we want to start saying we've got to have better conversations, we've got to ask better questions, we have to be brave and courageous and start really saying we may not come to the same point on this, but the conversation we will have about it is important. It's important. There's things to learn here. We've been silent for too long. We've kind of missed class. And there's a lot of other people who were not afraid to be talking about it, and they got to take the seats of power and the seats of choice, and now we're living in the reality that they've created. And we've got to get, I believe truly as people of faith, we have got to take back and sit in those seats and start having those tough conversations. And for a lot of us, it means just paying attention, listening to podcasts like this, paying attention to where people are having conversations, listen in, start learning, start finding out what's going on in your community and what your school board, your local politics, your representatives, what are they voting on? What is their voting platform? For so many of us, we don't know. And I don't think we get to sit any longer and say, it's just too much, or it's just over my head, or that's a realm of, I don't talk about politics, or we don't do politics. We do. I mean, politics is our it's who we are. It's how we relate in our society. And we have to, as people of faith, start participating.
I think it's so important, to say that politics is who we are, right? So often we think of politics as like this thing that's over here, oh, those people do that. The reality is we all live in politics all the time.
All the time.
And we'll sometimes joke about the church being too political, and like we don't always mean like politics, but like the reality is this church is wrapped up in politics, right? And we're seeing this more and more with the rise of, Christian nationalism, if not white Christian nationalism. But like, so to think that these are separate spheres and that we're not fully integrated into all these spheres at the same time it's just not true, And so thank you for calling that out. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that piece, and to the social principles, right? Like we have guiding principles in the midst of this as a denomination. And so it shouldn't be shocking, I guess, at this point, but people just don't know about them often, right? And like at the last general conference, they were actually revised. And so we have revised social principles now because they hadn't been revised in a very long time.
They had not.
Which is great though. But when I talk with young adults, a lot of times one of the things they also talk about is finding a church that's authentic to like expression of who they are versus who they say they are, And we've seen it a lot with like the idea of what does it mean to be inclusive, and like we've heard about those a lot of times, but even this realm of like, what does it mean to actually care about environmental justice as opposed to just like, on Earth Day having a sermon about it, like that's a step, right? Like that's a first step, and we're grateful, but like, how are you using your building, and are you being responsible with the way you use your building? And is it, do Do you think about those decisions? And we passed a resolution at annual conference this past year about like making sure we're taking steps on the use of our buildings and having somebody who's heading up a green team on your church community, not staff necessarily, but on one of your committees, to be like asking the questions of what does this mean for the creation as a whole as we make these church decisions.
I'd love to, and I know I'm jumping in on your part here, but I'd love to use that example as sort of a jumping off point, because this is where Texas Impact has really helped me as a clergy person and would help any clergy person in just paying attention to the work of Texas Impact. Environmental justice is a huge one. Yeah. I'm a United Methodist. I read our social principles. I care about God's creation. Check. Right? Like when I listen to, global warming, like yes, I believe it's a problem. Sure. Check. Like that seems like enough. But we were sitting last fall in the legislative session of the Texas Impact Legislative Council, no longer board, but Legislative Council, deciding what the next 2 years look like for us as a nonprofit agency, what things were going to be most important, that we were going to advocate for our legislators to, take priority in passing laws or passing changes that have to do with these things. And environmental justice came up. And all of a sudden, we're starting to talk about Bitcoin mining. And I'm sitting here going, what? Like, what does that have to do with environmental justice? Right. Because
it's not an oil spill.
I'll just name my naivete in this. Like, I didn't know that Bitcoin mining has anything to do with our environment, right? Until a couple of months ago when I'm sitting and talking about why this is a legislative environmental policy that we want to make sure.
It might crash our electrical grid. It's fine. It's fine. Everything's fine.
We in Texas have PTSD about the electrical grid around here.
And we should continue to, because it's going to continue to be a problem. Yeah. But I mean, to find out that Bitcoin mining, first of all, Texas is the second highest state of Bitcoin mining. Only under Georgia is there more of it going on. And how much water it takes to run Bitcoin mining and how much electricity it takes, and the fact that now they're starting to see where these plants are. First of all, these plants are being put normally in underutilized and underprivileged communities, right? And there's now health concerns for neighbors next to these plants. I mean, you never think about these things when you're just like, there's a news article about Bitcoin mining. I don't care about Bitcoin mining, so I'll just scroll past. But this actually matters for our neighbors, for people that we love. It matters that we have water resources in times of drought. It matters to us as United Methodists that we care about these things. And I think that's probably the most important part, is when we just say like, politics, I don't want to get involved. Yeah, but then when it comes down to the fact that you're talking about a neighborhood next to a future church that you're a part of that now is dealing with the effects of this, or you're talking about, major political decisions that are happening without us paying attention. We have got to pay attention, I think, as United Methodists. And going back to why this is important, our young people are paying attention. Exactly and if you want to connect to the young people in your community that are walking in the doors of your church, start paying attention to this stuff, because they are, and they want to know that people of faith are paying attention and going to make a difference in the way that they live their lives concerning these things that are affecting our neighbors.
Well, as you're sharing, Ashley, and I can't help but think that kind of stepping out and saying, I'm not going to participate is something we do when we're comfortable. Right? And it's something we do to preserve our comfort. Yeah. Right? I like being comfortable. For sure. We all do. And yet there are moments, if we're going to love God well and love our neighbor well, we need to set aside our own comfort to step into a realm of potential conversation that's going to challenge us, push us to learn something that may, cause a challenge within our relational network, that may just open us to an opportunity that we weren't aware of before. We spent the entire summer in my church working through a book called I Think You're Wrong, But I'm Listening.
Nice.
And the impulse was to, whether it's in your family, whether it's in in your workplace, whether it's in just your neighborhood and normal life, engage in these kind of political conversations with a community that is not going to agree with you, in service of not necessarily changing your mind, but being intentionally deeply engaged. Right? Because you got to do your own homework before you're going to go to the conversation with the person who, not that your aim is to convince them either, but to fully understand and articulate where it is you're coming from. And in that process, we learn things. Yeah. And in that process, we are formed and shaped. And through that, our neighborhoods are formed and shaped in a meaningful way. Yep. And so this is not just a once every 4-year cycle, right? As good Methodist preachers, we've got the Surviving the Election sermon series in the can, right? It cranks out once every 4 years. It's usually once an appointment cycle because, we get moved on a fairly regular basis, right? But it's an ongoing thing of where are, Phil, you mentioned earlier, so often the work of Texas Impact is aimed at, how is this impacting the most marginalized communities among us? And then there are some spaces and circles where UMC stands for upper middle class. That can be a place of comfort. I've been a United Methodist my whole life. I've been upper middle class my whole life, raised by lawyers. Comfort's great.
Yeah.
But there's moments where Jesus challenges us. And if we're going to be formed, we've got to step out beyond that space into a place where we're open to seeing and hearing and being in ministry with our neighbors in a meaningful way. Phil, have you had one of those aha moments? Ashley Ann named hers kind of with Bitcoin mining, which I'm still not entirely sure how it works either. I know how mining works. I know what a Bitcoin is. I don't see how the two work together, except for there's lots of servers involved and so many servers. But have you had your own aha moment through this season?
Yeah, one. There's a lot of them, right? Like there's been a lot of issues that have come up in the state of Texas over the last 4 years while I've served on the board. I mean, I think one of them was when Roe v. Wade was overturned, right? And like, there were even as a Texas Impact, our executive director, who's been there for I don't know 15 years. It's a 50-year-old organization, and she's been there for a big part of it. And she said, when I was hired here, they said there's two things you don't talk about in Texas: you don't talk about abortion, and you don't talk about guns. And we, for the first time at our legislative session, where we get together to decide what our legislative agenda is going to be, had decided we have to. Like we're to the point now, like we have to talk about it. Like we have to, as people of faith, provide people with resources around this. So when Roe was overturned, I can remember exactly where I was standing. My mom and my wife were right there, and they both started crying. And so immediately I reached out to our senior pastor. This is when I was working at White Rock, and I said, on Sunday morning, I'd like to hold a gathering to talk about this. And I want to review what the social principles say about it, and I want to provide a space to just be in conversation with one another. And even though White Rock's probably one of the more progressive congregations in our conference, right? Like, not everyone is of one mind, right? Especially on that issue. Yeah. And so the first thing we did, again, we read that social principle, and then I reminded everybody that when we do work around politics, it's always that we are addressing issues. We are never partisan, right? It's we're always political. We are never partisan. And
that distinction, I think, gets missed, and especially when you talk about young people, right? The church, right, has been painted with a brush that is, and we've earned it, right? Not necessarily present company excluded, maybe, but we've been associated for the last 40 years as to be Christian is to be a specific party.
The moral majority, right? I mean, like And
the truth is there are good and faithful Christians who vote for every party.
For sure.
And to be political is not to be partisan. Thank you for that.
And my voting tends to go one way, but like I met with my House representative recently and I for Texas, and I just flat out told him, like, these are all the ways I'm really disappointed in the Democratic Party too. Like that there's a lot of things that I'm never going to declare myself one way or the other, because I'm going to always stick to specific issues and vote like based on how my faith calls me to vote on these things. And so like I'm going to continue to pressure you as my elected representative on these issues. And when I feel like your party or the other party is falling short on them, like I need you to know, not only me, but the people that like I'm in ministry with as well, feel this way about those things. And like if anybody's listening, the one thing you could do, like reach out to your representatives, right? Like again, we had breakfast for almost 2 hours with my House representative, and great conversation. And he's like a person of deep faith as well. And it was just a really helpful conversation. But I would say the Roe was just because I got the full picture of it. It really my family's effect, how it hurt them, and then being able to sit with my congregation and really have a heartfelt conversation around it, right? And nobody was like, there was no vitriol around it, like toward each other, There was a deep desire to understand each other better, and even like the ones who like seemed like they were on polar opposites, like coming together and like hugging one another and like being grateful for the time shared in conversation about it.
And if we really believe, if we really truly believe that in order for there to be justice in the world, hearts have to change, then we as faith leaders are at the top of being in the political realm of changing things. Because hearts have to change. Yep. We're not going to change the world with a vote. We're going to change the world with one conversation after another conversation after another conversation where hearts change. And I think part of this was seen a year ago when Houston Votes did a whole lot of back behind the scenes work for the school voucher vote, where it was pretty clear that school vouchers were going to be passed. And then all of a sudden, people got on the phones, people got on writing campaigns. They had over 10,000 letters written in to legislatures, to representatives, and it wasn't. We got through one more year of school vouchers not being passed, which was important for our public schools to and we could talk about public school funding.
You too can join the public school defenders team through Texas Impact.
We need everybody to join this year on public education funding. But I mean, we think every 4 years we'll get back to the conversation. Yeah. But it is right now, we can make a difference by having conversations with our legislature, with our representatives, with people who are sitting at the desk making a difference, and just with our neighbors. Yeah. So that the next time a vote does come, they're thinking different. Right. We're thinking different. We're thinking more holistically about our neighborhoods and not just us.
And we utilize that gift we have of voting better when we're informed.
That's right.
Absolutely.
And so many of these decisions impact, we think of the big picture stuff, but you think about the kids who come down for kids' time on Sunday morning and the education they received. It's formed by our informed participation in this environment as people of faith, and we have a voice to bring to that. Yeah. We're about the 30-minute mark here on the podcast. And so I'm curious, as we draw things to a close, if you've kind of got one final nugget, one word of invitation, one lasting thing, if people hear nothing else through this conversation today, that you want people to make sure that they hear and they take with them as we go forth into 2025.
Go ahead.
I would say go to the Texas Impact website, read of some of the things that we're involved in, pick one thing that interests you and start studying it. Start researching it. Start having conversations with your friends about it. That one thing, because you're right, you can go to that and be like, oh my goodness, I'm overwhelmed. I can't do all the things. Yeah. And we can't do all the things. But if you pick one thing that really interests you, that you have a passion and a broken heart for, take that and invest in informing yourself about what does it mean? What are my local representatives? How have they voted on this issue in the past? Is there a conversation that I can have with my neighbors about this? Can I move the needle at all on this? And I think that if we all did that, where would we be?
I love that. Yeah, I'll just make the shameless plug of at Texas Impact, we have teams. And so there's a rapid response team that's really about calling and texting legislators. There's a public defenders team, which I just mentioned, the reproductive policy team, climate action team, in gun violence, and then immigration, which, immigration is going to be a real big one too this year and years going forward. So I think that it's, if you've never made the connection of how your faith influences politics, dear God, please reach out. Like, I would love to, and it's not like an accusing or a guilt thing. It's not an attack thing. It's what really drove me into this work was going to seminary and diving deeper into the theology, into the scriptures, and recognizing that the amount of times justice is mentioned in the Bible, and trying to figure out what justice really means. My faith is what roots me in this work. Yeah. And if you've never figured out how to bridge those two together, I would love to have a conversation about how to do that.
That'd be beautiful.
Yeah.
And if you're looking this beginning of the new year for a place to ground yourself in the scriptures, read the Gospel of Luke.
Absolutely.
And read it on repeat throughout the year. Yes. It is an incredible gift to us and helps us see that this is not just stuff that Phil cares about. It's not just stuff that Ashley Ann cares about. Jesus cared about the forming of community that is whole making for all of God's children.
Mary's song will mess you up. Right. If you really start looking at the words, Mary's song and what Luke 2, I think is whatever, it just,
I preached it for Sunday of Advent. Yeah. Yes, I hear you. So again, if you want to be formed in this, you want to have a conversation about where your faith meets this, talk to Phil. If you want to dive deep into an issue so that you can become, because it is impossible to know everything about all the things.
Yep.
Talk to Ashley Ann, go to the Texas Impact website. One of the things that was formative for me, one of my best friends is a school board member. Yes. And I didn't know the ins and outs of local public ed until he ran for school board. And I feel like I'm a much more informed parent now because of the conversations we've had. Yep. It's been that personal invitation into the diving deep. Yeah. And it helps form not only me, but the faith communities that we're a part of too. So,
and that's so important. Sorry to cut you off there, but it's so important to recognize, when they say all politics is local, it really is, right? So if you're looking to somewhere to start with your neighborhood association, and whatever your thing is you really care about. Like, people were complaining about dog poop on the. Yeah, I'm like, so like let's figure out how to rally together and organize and like start putting receptacle bins around our community so that people can have a place to throw their. I mean, that's something so small, but like, this is what we're talking about with politics, right? Like, there's nothing that's so minuscule that it's not important, and like that gets you back to knowing your neighbors, and really that's what it comes down to, relationship.
It does. Phil, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Ashley Ann, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for being with us today on Pod Strangely Warmed. Until next time, I'm Daniel Hawkins. This has been Pod Strangely Warmed. If you enjoyed our conversation today, know that you can find us anywhere you find podcasts. On Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube, any and all the places, we are there. So if you want to continue the good United Methodist conversation that you've been a part of today, find us, like us, rate us, review us, and share with a friend so that the good news that is happening right here in our own midst can amplify even more.
I got so much more excited though. You're great. You're great for this
That's it.
role. I was like, ooh, we're doing
Here
a
we go.
pod. Here we go.
Look at you. We're on
This
the
is Pod on
pod.
Fire. This is Strangely Warm. This is Pod on Fire.